It puzzled me that the violently anti-capitalist Communist Party would be supported by some of the most prominent capitalists in the world. But I finally realized that the Russian Revolution was not ultimately about the triumph of an economic ideology. It was about the culmination of an age-old struggle between two powerful peoples, the Jews and the Russians, in an ethnic war that tragically ended in the totalitarian tyranny of the communist dictatorship. Even worse, the score was ultimately settled in the terror of the blood-washed cellars of the Cheka and the frozen death of the gulags. The fact that supercapitalists such as Jacob Schiff could support a nakedly socialist regime such as communism made me question whether there was something more to communism than met the eye. What was it about communism that made it so attractive to Jews who were largely well-educated, non-proletarians, when communism was supposed to be, in Lenin's words, a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat? Obviously, by and large, Jews were nothing like Marx's workers of the world, for no group was more involved in capitalism or the manipulation and use of capital than the Jewish community. I checked out the communist personalities that Maddie Smith told me were in the Jewish who's who in world Jewry: atheist Leon Trotsky, as well as atheist Maxim Litvinov, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, are proudly listed in a directory of famous Jews compiled by the leading Jewish rabbinical groups of the world. Winston Churchill, in his eloquent article, Zionism versus Bolshevism, A Struggle for the Soul of the Jewish People, had argued that communism and Zionism were distinct ideologies that were competing, as he put it, for the soul of the Jewish people. But something didn't seem quite kosher in the supposed titanic struggle, for it appeared that many Zionists also supported communism, and at least in the early years, many communists were sympathetic to Zionists. Millions of Jews, even supercapitalists such as Jacob Schiff, supported the communist revolution in Russia. The struggle seemed to be like that of two brothers who might sometimes argue between themselves, but who always stand together against their common enemies. In 1975, I read a book called Trotsky and the Jews, written by Joseph Nadava and published by the Jewish Publication Society, Philadelphia, in 1971. The book points out that before the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, born Lev Bronstein, used to play chess with Baron Rothschild of the famous Rothschild banking family. Quote, a Jewish journalist, M. Waldman, who knew Trotsky from the period of his stay in Vienna, when he used to play chess with Baron Rothschild in Café Centre and frequent Café Daily to read the press there. What could the Rothschilds, the biggest banking house in Europe, possibly have in common with a leader who wanted to destroy capitalism and private property? Conversely, why would a dedicated communist be a close friend of the most powerful capitalist oppressor in the world? Could it be that they saw communism and Zionism as two very different avenues to a similar goal of power and revenge against the czars? A number of questions arose. Could communism simply have been a tool they adapted to defeat and rule their Russian antagonists? Did the Jews believe they were in conflict with only Russians or with other peoples of the world as well? Was communism originally part of a strategic imperative that reached far beyond the confines of Soviet Russia? These were important questions. I thought that I might find their answers in the philosophical origins of communism. I resolved to investigate the ideological roots of communism. I found Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto in my public library. Karl Marx's books were obtuse, especially the parts describing the Hegelian dialectic, but they made some sense if one believed that mankind had a machine-like nature as Marx theorized. One of my teachers made the oft-repeated, poorly thought-out comment that communism was great in theory but faulty in practice. To my way of thinking, to be a great idea, it must work in practice, and communism obviously doesn't. There has never been a theory that has promised more human happiness, yet delivered more poverty, mental and physical oppression, and more human misery and death. Until I looked into the foundations of communism, I'd always thought that Karl Marx was a German. In fact, I read that Marx's father was a Christian. Well, it turns out that his father, a successful lawyer, was a Jew who had converted to Christianity after an edict prohibited Jews from practicing law. Much later, in 1977, I read an article from the Chicago Jewish Sentinel boasting that Marx was the grandson of a rabbi and the descendant of Talmudic scholars for many generations. An excellent article in the Barnes Review points out the racism of Marx and Engels. Not only was Karl Marx from a long line of Talmudic scholars, he also hated Russians with a passion that could be described as pathological. I looked up Karl Marx in the Jewish encyclopedias, and I found to my amazement that the man who taught him many of the principles of communism was Moses Hess. As incredible as it might seem, contemporary Zionist leaders venerate Moses Hess as the forerunner of modern Zionism. The Encyclopedia of Zionism in Israel, under the entry for Moses Hess, is the following. Pioneer of modern socialism, social philosopher, and forerunner of Zionism, Hess was thus a forerunner of political and cultural Zionism and of socialist Zionism in particular. He became deeply involved in the rising socialist movement. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels acknowledged that they had learned much from him during the formative years of the movement. The Encyclopedia of Zionism in Israel, unquote. After months of reading from many major first-hand sources, I realized that the elderly lady at the offices of the Citizens Council had been essentially right, at least about the origins of the Communist Revolution. I felt as if I were sitting on the edge of a volcano. Every new piece of information seemed to both confirm and clarify the issue even further. In the last days of the Romanovs, Robert Wilton, on assignment for the London Times in Russia for 17 years, summed up the Russian Revolution in these words. The whole record of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia is indelibly impressed with the stamp of an alien invasion. The murder of the Tsar, deliberately planned by the Jews Sverdlov and carried out by the Jews Goloshekin, Smolotov, Safarov, Voykov, and Yurovsky, is the act not of the Russian people, but of this hostile invader. In 1990, a major Jewish New York publisher, the Free Press, a division of Simon & Schuster, published a book by Israeli historian Louis Rappaport called Stalin's War Against the Jews. In it, the author casually admits what we Gentiles are not supposed to know. Quote, many Jews were euphoric over their high representation in the new government. Lenin's first Politburo was dominated by men of Jewish origins. Also, under Lenin, Jews became involved in all aspects of the revolution, including its dirtiest work. Despite the communist vow to eradicate anti-Semitism, it spread rapidly after the revolution, partly because of the prominence of so many Jews in the Soviet administration, as well as in the traumatic and human Sovietization drives that followed. Historian Salo Baron has noted that an immensely disproportionate number of Jews joined the new Soviet secret police, the Cheka, and many of those who fell afoul of the Cheka would be shot by Jewish investigators. The collective leadership that emerged in Lenin's dying days was headed by the Jew Zinoviev, a loquacious, curly-headed, etc., etc. I began to realize that there was once widespread knowledge of the Jewish leadership of the Russian Revolution. An example of that can be found in the National Geographic's magazine of May 1907 edition. An article entitled The Revolution in Russia describes the Jewish leadership of the terroristic communist revolution. Quote, the revolutionary leaders nearly all belong to the Jewish race, and the most effective revolutionary agency is the Jewish Bund. The government has suffered more from that race than from all of its other subjects combined. Whenever a desperate deed is committed by it, it's always done by a Jew, and there's scarcely one loyal member of that race in the entire empire. Quote, the facts were indisputable. An enormous fact of history has been wiped away from the intellectual consciousness of the West as thoroughly as a file can be erased from the hard disk of a desktop computer. In this classic novel, 1984, George Orwell wrote about historical truth going down the memory hole. This has been the fate of the truth regarding the real perpetrators of the Russian